Hello guys, getting started now with the makeup lecture for week 4. So I've got the slides all printed out. You all can see those on YSEC. These ones, in fact. So let's get started. So the security dilemma is the first of our big strategic concepts. So this originally came from the military security realm, and that's how most people would see it, but I want you to think about it as something a little bit bigger because it goes beyond simply military sources of security. So we start with power and security, the basic calculus that we talked about in weeks 1 and 2. We looked at deterrence, which more on that later, but basically the ability to achieve your own security is also the ability to threaten somebody else's security most of the time. So the key thing to appreciate about the security dilemma is it really is a dilemma. It explains why states that don't want to go to war or don't particularly want to get into any military action with each other can still very easily do so. If it was just, hey, I want to start a war with you, you want to start a war with me, let's get it on. We don't need a theory for that. That's just people choosing what they want to do, right? So in cases where I didn't think they wanted to go to war, but here we are, they're fighting, the security dilemma is designed to explain that. That also is a key feature of neorealism, aka defensive realism. Don't call it defensive realism, just call it neorealism. But the idea of the security dilemma does some heavy lifting in the theory. Okay? We also can talk here about arms races, except that people don't normally talk about arms races anymore because they tried to make the theory of the arms race very quantifiable, and we can measure exactly increases in military spending in direct response to other people's military spending, but that doesn't really work anymore for reasons that I might go into if someone asks me in class. Okay, moving on to the next slide. When I talk about broader security interests, this is what I meant by the security dilemma not being a purely military concept. So essentially, every state defines its interest in a variety of ways. And while their primary interest might be not getting invaded today, the longer a state has been around, especially the more powerful it is, the more economic and political entanglements it has with other countries, the more broadly it's going to define its security. So if my only concern was military invasion and you build up your military forces, they could come over and invade me. I'm using my hands too much for a weird video presentation. Sorry, I'll try to stop doing that. If my only concern is your military coming in to invade me, then I might be able to work around that with you. We might be able to say, look, I've got military forces. You've got military forces. Why don't we just try and chill them out a little bit? I'll back my forces off the border. You do it with yours. It seemed to work for the 2 Koreas so far. This kind of thing. But when countries start to define their security interests as having all kinds of elements, military, social, political, ecological, and having far broader geographic reach, where it's not just you coming at me with a threat, but you doing something in another country that may or may not even be a military type threat to that other country. Maybe you're increasing your trade with that country, squeezing out my country's trade interests. Even that kind of thing can count as the kind of broader security interest that might lead to the same dynamics of insecurity and escalation that we get from the traditional military model of the security dilemma. Okay? So when I talk about intrinsic or instrumental security interests, it's a distinction that isn't always entirely useful because it can be both depending on how you look at it. You might have an interest that is closely related to your security, or it could just be we benefit from this. And we'll look at some examples in the next slide. So on to the next slide. So here's some examples on the broader security interest 2 slide. Israel objected to the sale of defensive weapons systems to Egypt specifically. Now this is like an air defense system, the kind of thing Syria is looking to get more of from Russia right now. Number 2, China, the PRC China blocks ROC China, Taiwan, from joining even something as simple as, I believe, the World Health Organization. This would be helping Chinese people in Taiwan to not get sick so much, which you would think would be okay for the Chinese government in Beijing, which claims to represent all those Chinese people. But they have really gone out of their way to block Taiwan from getting into any organization that has state members. Okay? And thirdly, the example I introduced in week 2, but then didn't have time to go into detail about, was about how China's military modernization threatens the United States, despite the fact that China is probably about 2 centuries away from building up its military to the point where they could ever invade the United States. Even, taking Hawaii seems like an incredible stretch right now, to the point where it's literally science fiction. So how do we make sense of these policy concerns by these countries in terms of the security dilemma? That's what the next slide is for. So, thinking of the way Israel frames its security, you have to go back to the 6-Day War. So Israel has fought a lot of wars. It's fought, importantly, the Yom Kippur War after the 6-Day War. And their model for military self-defense really revolves around knocking out one enemy quickly so that they can go and cover their other flank, because Israel is the definition of surrounded. So the way they see it, any air defense system that could threaten to shoot down Israeli fighters, Israeli bombers, as they come over to bomb Egypt, is a threat to Israel. See? They need to be able to confidently send in their bombers to knock out any Egyptian problems they see quickly and safely, so that they can then send their air force to knock out the next opponent. Okay? So you can't attack Israel with air defense systems, and it wouldn't really make it harder for Israel to defend themselves from the Egyptian Air Force if the Egyptians attacked Israel, but it would make it harder for Israel to attack Egypt, and that is seen as a threat to their security. A little bit Twilight Zone, but this is the world we live in. Okay, so the next example, China, as I'm sure you all know, defines its national security as protecting sovereignty, and sovereignty includes Taiwan as part of China, the one China policy. Okay, to the Chinese mind, it really seems like the separation of Taiwan from the rest of China is an ongoing injury to China. And so anything that could threaten to legitimize that or extend the duration of this injury, this separation, China sees as a security threat. Okay? And the third example, going back to the early days of the post-Cold War world, the United States strategic planners started thinking of this idea of a peer competitor and how we're number one, we'd like to stay number one, we'd like to maintain this unipolar system. And so our overriding security concern from the American perspective is to prevent the rise of another superpower that could knock the Americans back from their current unipolar position to a bipolar position, a la the Cold War. Okay? So, none of these concerns involve anything approaching a traditional conventional military threat. But all of these are very significantly aspects of how these countries see their security, and they act on the basis of these concerns just as they would react to military threats. And so this, in a way, it makes the security dilemma weaker as a theory, but in another sense, it makes the security dilemma much more useful to us because we don't just have to be looking at military budgets all the time. Okay, we can actually look at how these countries essentially socially construct their ideas of what their security interests are. And this is what we're going to be talking about more next week. So I guess that means I should probably move on to another slide. Okay, so deterrence and compellence. We've already talked about the idea that the military serves a role even when you're not using it. And arguably the best use for a military, either conventional or especially nuclear, is don't use it. The capability of using it is the greatest utility because then you get all the benefits and none of the cost of actually having to go into a war. So, a lot of people struggle with this separation, deterrence and compellence. They both involve the threat of force. Deterrence says, don't do something. You're thinking about doing it, I don't want you to do it, so don't take that action. So it's preventative. Compellence is essentially making someone do something that they don't want to do. Okay? But it gets tricky because sometimes you would compel somebody to stop doing something that they're already doing. So that's not deterrence because you didn't deter them. They're doing it now, but you use force to get them to stop doing that thing. Okay? So this leads to the gray areas. Imagine a situation something like the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This isn't a clear parallel, but imagine if things had been a little bit different, where the Americans had said to the Iraqis, don't invade Kuwait, or we will use force against you. And that would be a deterrent threat, right? Trying to use force, the threat of force, to prevent action. And the Iraqis had not believed the deterrent threat for some reason, and they had invaded Kuwait. And then if, and again, this is hypothetical because this isn't how the Iraq War in 1991 worked out, but if the Americans had then threatened to bomb the presidential palace in Baghdad unless Iraq withdrew its troops from Kuwait, and the Iraqis withdrew, that would have been a compellent force, okay? The threat of force to stop an action, in this case, the occupation of Kuwait, okay? Often, and probably more convenient to think about, you're using a compellent threat of force to make them do something that they don't want to do something positive rather than something negative, stopping what they're doing. Okay? The key element of this is the whole rational actor model. In other words, you're thinking about doing something, or you actually have decided to do something, and you did that because you thought it would be a profitable move for you. And I am adding the cost of my potential use of force to change your cost-benefit calculus. Okay? Sure, if America doesn't intervene, Iraq can profitably take Kuwait. Kuwait is sitting on tons of oil. Literally, it's a very easy situation for Iraq to say, we will benefit if we do this. The American threat to use force if they do it, okay, now it's not worth it, because we may not even succeed, and even if we do, it would decimate our military. Add to that, economic sanctions and the possibility of a coalition of countries against Iraq, and then the economic and the political costs, as well as the military costs, outweigh the benefits. Okay? So, it's crucial to think of this as an area of an overlap between the military and the diplomatic. Okay, it's the military capabilities that give you the power to make these threats. And if they sort of call your bluff, if you have to carry out that threat, then it's the military force again that would actually be doing that. But it would tend to be a diplomat who is making that threat. Okay? So, on to the next slide. Key features of deterrence and compellence: clarity, credibility, and cost. So, it is really, really tricky to do deterrence and compellence for anything other than don't attack me, right? Don't attack me is simple, because obviously I have to defend myself. If you attack me, you can safely assume that I will use all or almost all of my resources to protect myself from your attack, right? So you don't even need to communicate a deterrent threat in many cases, if not most cases, because your potential adversary would understand all of your military capabilities would be used to deter you. Okay? Think about something like, actually, the Korean War is a good example. There was some talk before the Korean War, and including public statements by, I think it was the U.S. Secretary of Defense Dulles, that the United States had a clear idea of its regions of vital importance that it would use force to defend. And he explicitly said an area of concern that did not include South Korea. Now, some people in South Korea are very critical of this, claiming that by not including South Korea, they invited the North Korean attack in 1950. Okay? So, I'm certain that inside the White House, at the time, the Americans were very clear that they would use force to protect South Korea if South Korea was ever invaded. But because that was not clearly communicated to the North Koreans, because the North Koreans and their allies could see American public statements that suggested, yeah, maybe the Americans just aren't that invested in Korea, they're focusing on Europe, they're focusing on Japan, we can go in and score an easy win. Okay? Lack of clarity in 1950 arguably led to the Korean War. So that was a deterrence failure. Now, you can say that you're going to do this or that if your enemy does something you don't like. But what if they don't believe you? If you make a clear deterrent or compellent threat, but they don't believe that you will carry it out when the rubber meets the road, again, you're looking at a deterrence failure. So I think we mentioned this in class last week. Consider the possibility of a nuclear umbrella. America has threatened clearly that they would extend their nuclear deterrent capability to protect Japan and South Korea. But is that something we can really believe if they're attacked by a North Korea that has enough weapons left over after they've nuked Japan to also nuke America? Okay? There are very real questions about the credibility of that. In fact, going back to the Iraq War example, the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, what actually happened is that the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, who was a woman, tried to clearly communicate to Saddam Hussein that America would stand in defense of Kuwait. Now, there are some who have suggested that the threat was less credible to someone like Saddam Hussein because it was coming from a woman. Okay, it's all speculation at this point because, after all, they did kill Saddam Hussein. But that's something to consider. And maybe there are, in various cases, cultural elements to consider in terms of what makes a threat both clear and credible. Okay? But the final element is the cost. You are threatening to impose a cost on them if they do something that you don't want them to. Or in the case of compellence, if they don't do something that you want them to. Even if you clearly communicate that, and they believe that you will impose that cost on them, if they still see the benefits of going ahead, for example, with attacking you, if they see the benefits of attacking you as being greater than the costs, your deterrence will fail. Okay? So on this slide, I have two quotes from Schelling, and again, Schelling is the godfather of strategic thinking, absolutely a book you all want to read before you graduate. So the first quote on deterrence: deterrence involves setting the stage and waiting. The overt act is up to the opponent, and deterrence needs to be indefinite in its timing. So I have for example, my defenses set up. If you attack me, I will use these weapons to hurt you, to impose a cost on you for attacking me. Okay? That has to be indefinite. You don't want them to think, oh, he's only willing to deter me with this military capability for a limited amount of time. I'll just wait him out and then I'll attack without that deterrent threat. That's no good. So that's why Schelling said it has to be indefinite. Compellence involves initiating an action that can cease or become harmless only if the opponent responds. Okay? So the first act is yours, as Schelling said, which is a little bit problematic, I'll admit, because often they are doing something, they make an act, and then you initiate a counteract to compel them to stop that act. Okay, remember I said sometimes compellence can look an awful lot like deterrence. Okay, so I'm going to do something that will cause you pain that can cease or become harmless only if you do what I want. Okay, so this is really important, and we see this in cybersecurity, which, if you're interested, there's a really good course on cybersecurity this semester that you should all be taking. But what happens if the Americans say to the Chinese, we don't like what you're doing, we will hack you if you don't do something we want you to do? And the Chinese will look at that and say, well, the Americans are hacking us all the time anyway, so I'm not sure that compellent threat really works. That means if we do what they want, they'll never hack us again. No, it doesn't work that way. Okay. Also, the deadline. Remember, Schelling said that deterrence needs to be indefinite and compellence has to have a deadline. Okay? I want you to do this thing means I want you to do this thing now, or by tomorrow, by the end of the week, whatever. There has to be a deadline. Otherwise, they can wait you out forever and your compellent threat becomes meaningless. Okay? You can see from all of this just how complex compellence can be. So, let's move on to the next slide, or possibly take a break. So, I want to look at a couple of the variables that affect whether deterrence compellence will be effective. A couple of things here. Firstly, deterrence and compellence both involve decisions to be made at a certain time. It's a threat, right? So it's easy to make a threat, but if they do what you don't want, or if they don't do what you want, you have to actually take action. So what can easily happen is that you make a threat and then they kind of call your bluff, they don't comply, and then you have to make another decision. Is it actually worth it? So one of the ways you can make your threats more effective is to essentially take out that element of choice. We see this in the case of the Korean Peninsula in particular. There are a small number of American forces north of Seoul, on the border, basically. And I've talked to a couple of guys who are based there, and they are not confident about their chances of surviving a North Korean invasion. Okay? In a way, they are there to die for the sake of American foreign policy and, of course, South Korean security. If North Korea invades South Korea, they have to go through those American forces. They have to kill American soldiers. In that context, it is almost unimaginable that back in Washington, the American government decides not to fully commit more forces to the defense of South Korea. Okay? That's what a tripwire force is, and that's one of the things that protects us, at least on the conventional side, from North Korea. So another great example of this is from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Kennedy administration was hopelessly caught off guard, and they had very little time to react when they finally found out that strategic Soviet missiles were being shipped into Cuba to be put into silos that had already been constructed. Do you attack the Soviet ships that are carrying those missiles? If you do, that's an act of war, right? Not a good idea. On the other hand, if you just let them set up those missiles, they permanently have that capability to launch before you're ready and catch you off guard and potentially win a nuclear war. Plus, it would take away America's flexibility in dealing with Cuba. You can't use force against the Castro regime, which we knew that the Americans wanted to do, because Cuba's got nukes, essentially. Okay. So what they did, they set up a blockade, and they made the Soviets make a decision. So imagine you're the captain of a Soviet naval vessel, and you are faced with running an American blockade, which basically means committing an act of war yourself by using force or threatening force against American ships. Okay, if you try to run the blockade and an American ship gets in your way, you either stop or you smash into the ship deliberately. We have World War III. Okay, so the genius of that particular move by Kennedy was that, as Schelling puts it, he maneuvered the Soviets into a position so that they had to make that decision to start a war or not. And as we know, the Soviets decided not to start a war. They backed down. Okay? If you can't make something automatic, you can at least put more commitment into it. Now, politically, this is quite easy, maybe too easy, in fact. If you talk a lot about how you're going to do this if they don't do that, we will punish them if they don't comply with our compelling threat, and then they don't comply and you don't follow through the threat, you look weak. You look weak and incompetent, and that is the kind of thing that can cost you elections, can strengthen your political opponents. As we've seen, being weak and incompetent can still get you elected to powerful political offices, but in most cases, it won't. Okay? Another thing to consider is the alliances. If the alliance is built around a formal document committing you to use force if your ally is attacked, then if your ally is attacked and you don't use force to defend them, it doesn't just weaken that alliance, it weakens every alliance you have. Every other country that is thinking that you will help them if they get into trouble is going to doubt that, and they're going to start looking for other allies, other sources of security. And that weakens you. Okay? Something else that's crucial and really, really badly misunderstood is that you have to know what the other side is thinking. You have to know what their interests are. You have to make it something that is politically feasible for them, as well as, logistically possible. If you ask, for example, Kim Jong-un to give up all his nuclear weapons in 24 hours, that's not physically possible. If you ask him or tell him to get rid of all of his weapons within a year, dismantle the facilities at Yongbyon and all of the other research facilities they have, and open up the country to international inspectors without getting anything in return, it's a dictatorship. So theoretically, he can do that. He has that technical power. But the political cost would be so great that all of his domestic enemies would be emboldened. The North Korean people, they've swallowed a lot of propaganda, but even they would realize Kim Jong-un is not someone who can keep us safe. Maybe we should be looking for another dear supreme great leader. Okay? I said that it's about cost-benefit calculus. So you have to understand how the other side sees their benefits as well as their costs. Okay? Another thing to consider, the old metaphor of carrots and sticks. If you want to make a donkey move, you can beat it with a stick, or you can try to attract it with a carrot. In diplomacy, the same thing works. You can use the threat of military force as your stick. So, do this thing that I want you to do, or I'll hurt you, maybe militarily. But if you do what I want you to do, I can also offer you a trade deal, or I can ease sanctions, or I can increase investment, or some sort of aid. And what happened in the Cold War a lot is I will sell you weapons. Both the Soviets and the United States used arms transfers, so sometimes sales, sometimes it's giving high-tech weaponry to a lot of governments who otherwise wouldn't do a lot of business with it. Okay? And finally, and I'm totally serious about this, be crazy. If your opponent thinks they know where your lines are, if your opponent is thinking, yeah, he said he'd use force against us if we didn't comply, but he's too weak, he's not going to do it, then your compellant threats will not be effective. Your deterrent threats to protect allies will not be effective. But if your opponent is thinking, well, that dude's crazy, he could do anything, he might attack me even though he didn't mention that in the deal, I guess, just to be on the safe side, I will stay well clear of where the crazy dude has said the red lines are. Some people have said that this is an advantage to the Trump presidency, and to some extent this may be true. However, like all things with these strategic concepts, especially deterrence and compellence, you've got to be smart crazy. Okay? So, for example, during the campaign, Donald Trump said, essentially, I don't know if we really care about NATO anymore. Maybe NATO is not in our interest, and maybe we wouldn't come to the aid of a NATO ally if they were invaded, even though that is written into the NATO treaty. This is uncertainty, but it's the wrong kind of uncertainty. Here he's making his allies uncertain about whether he will protect them. He's making essentially the potential adversary more certain. So, I mean, basically NATO, if it's used militarily, it's most likely to defend against Russia at this point. So let's use Russia as the example. If Russia's leadership is contemplating making a move against the interest of NATO as a whole or a NATO member country, and President Trump has suggested he might not even make a move to defend a NATO ally, and then he pushes the president of Montenegro around at a NATO summit, something crazy like that. Maybe the deterrent threat of NATO is less effective. Maybe the Russian leadership, they can get away with attacking a smaller, weaker member, maybe one of the Baltic states, and not face the wrath of NATO. Okay? So, being crazy, being unpredictable, having your opponents thinking that you could easily carry out your deterrent and compellent threat, and you might even go beyond, or you might hit them before you said they'd hit them, before you said you would hit them, right? If you come this close, I'll attack you, and they think, well, we can go this close then. But if you have a reputation for being crazy, maybe they won't even get that close, because they'll evaluate that there is some percentage of retaliation. Okay, so that is deterrence and compellence. Next, escalation. So there's an interesting reading by Morgan, which I probably should have posted on YSEC. I'm recording this before I post on YSEC, so I guess I'll post the Morgan reading as well. He talked at great length about escalation, and especially the concept of escalation dominance, which is really, really important. So escalation is basically what it sounds like. There is some kind of dispute or maybe a conflict, and it goes to a higher level. Any increase in, as Morgan says, the intensity or scope of a conflict. So we could be having a political dispute, and then you make it an economic dispute by adding sanctions or tariffs or something like that. That is an increase in the intensity. You're going from one domain, the political domain or diplomatic domain, to the economic, right? Obviously, making it a military dispute would be a much higher escalation of intensity. But you can also essentially broaden the conflict, okay, and geographically or in issue areas. So we have a dispute about this particular issue, and then you say, well, we're upset about that as well as this other thing, and then you bring in this other issue as part of the either diplomatic dispute or potentially even a war could be escalated in this way. Okay, where you say our initial war aims were this, but now we want an even more grandiose victory, right? It's not that we want to beat them, but we will beat them so badly that they will unconditionally surrender. Okay, this was actually a major sticking point in the Pacific theater of World War II. The Americans had committed to making Japan unconditionally surrender, and they beat them militarily, and they were willing to negotiate a surrender. And the Americans said, well, no, not really. That's not going to work for us, because FDR had told the American people that they would bring the Japanese to their knees, right? If you're negotiating as sovereign nations and therefore as equals, that's not really the kind of unconditional surrender that he had promised. So that can be problematic. Okay? Think about how most wars begin. They begin with something relatively low level. It might be a dispute over territory, but you can do a lot of disputing over territory before any troops get deployed, before anybody starts shooting. Okay? Essentially, when you have that kind of dispute, both sides are using, let's be abstract, their power resources to get what they want from the other side, right? If we are negotiating at some sort of metaphorical bargaining table, and I can't get what I want through the negotiation process, then I'll take it somewhere else. I might, take it to an international organization, or I might start using sanctions to impose other costs on you. I might use military force or the threat thereof. Okay. So on the slide here, I give you some examples from disagreement, sanctions, deploying troops, warning shots, limited military engagement, large-scale invasion, total war. Essentially, each of those is a different level at which a conflict could occur. And even within those levels, you can imagine sub-levels. So think about what's going on now with the US and China and these trade sanctions, the tariffs, trade war, what have you. They haven't crossed from tariffs to something else, right? Nobody is talking about this becoming a shooting war, but it's gone from talking about putting tariffs on Chinese goods to actually putting tariffs on Chinese goods. And it stayed in this economic domain with China putting tariffs back on American goods. But they've been increasing the intensity of the trade war by putting more tariffs on more goods. Okay? So we could imagine within this trade war sort of level, different sub-levels. When you escalate, you have to ask yourself, what will your opponent do? Well, if you're negotiating, you're supposed to call them your counterpart rather than your opponent. But will they stay at the level that you chose? Presumably you chose it because you have an advantage there. You think you can win at that level, but not the lower level. What if your opponent goes to a higher level? So, escalation, second slide. The risks here involve, as I was saying earlier, the opponent's reactions. So, they could back down or they could commit more to the conflict. If you've escalated it to this level, they can take it to this. Essentially, you should never escalate a dispute unless you can see several moves ahead. Because I guess really we shouldn't call it escalation, because escalation makes us think of an escalator, which is, discrete steps. I will escalate one step. You may escalate one more step. But what it really is, it's a spiral. And so anytime you make an escalatory move, you can kind of anticipate that your opponent will make their own move, which may be escalatory. Okay? Then what are you going to do with that? You wanted it. Okay, firstly, it started out at this level, and you chose to raise it to this level. Do you want it to be at a higher level? You probably don't, because you chose only one level up, right? So if the opponent escalates to a higher level, things are already more serious than you had really wanted, right? If you have to match that level, again, they're going to respond. Or maybe you think, hey, they wanted to be at this level. I have to go to another level where I have more of an advantage. And so these things often escalate out of control. And you'll pardon not only my drama, but my poor use of memes in slide 11. So I think I did mention this in an earlier lecture, but I consider this to be a not completely unreasonable scenario. So North Korea tests an ICBM, and the US responds with fire and fury on a limited scale by maybe blowing up the test site. There was talk of this last year, back when they were still arguing about Guam, right? Now, to save face, North Korea would respond to the use of military force against North Korea with the use of military force against Seoul. One artillery round, one rocket, something like that would be symbolic. It would cause a little bit of property damage. If they got lucky, it would kill somebody. Actually, Seoul is so crowded it would almost certainly kill one or two people, although Israel has been the target of numerous rocket attacks and have avoided fatalities for the most part. But the US and ROK military have the potential to what's called counter battery fire, which is your radar tracks the course of the incoming rocket or artillery round, trace the location that came from, and hit it back with your own artillery fire. See, each of these steps is one level at which the other side feels which one side feels comfortable. So North Korea feels comfortable testing its ICBMs because, let's face it, they've been doing it for years, and economic sanctions seem to be a cost that they're willing to bear. The US escalates by using an actual military strike. That's an escalation. Testing your own weapons in your own territory is not really the use of military force in anything that looks like a war or a casus belli, a justification for war. But using force against another country, as the US does in step 2 here, that's a major escalation. That's potentially an act of war. Now, in step 3, North Korea stays at the same level. They don't escalate, but they don't back down either, and they're trying to get the other side to essentially accept them going to that level, letting them have the last word, right? Number 4, that's not really an escalation necessarily. It's not taking it out to another domain, but you're increasing the intensity within that conventional military step. North Korea could respond in step 5 with more rockets, more artillery fire. So what if the Americans and South Koreans respond by what actually looks like the beginnings of a war? Okay, so notice how in steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, we are really talking about the same domain. We are talking about the use of military force against a neighboring country. But within that domain, within that sort of step, if you will, there are a lot of sub-levels. There are a lot of ways you can increase the scope and the intensity of the conflict. At step 7, we would finally see a move to a completely different level, which is going from conventional military force to weapons of mass destruction. Okay? Now, I suspect that they're more likely to use WMDs against Japan, but they could use them against South Korea or American bases within South Korea if they thought that was the best way to achieve their goals, which might be political or might be military in terms of destroying the forces that could invade them in the next step. Okay? This is a possible escalation chain. At any one step, your step seems reasonable, but the next step that the other side takes, that might be more than you bargained for. So the real danger of escalation is human stupidity, just limited thinking. They did this, so I will do that. And the assumption there is that you're going to get the last word. And the history of war is people thinking they were going to get the last word, and there being a lot more words after that. Okay? So that's why anytime you are considering, or your government is considering, any kind of retaliation, whether it is retaliation to tariffs or the sinking of like the Chonan or the is it Yongpyeong-do, that was the island that was hit by artillery in 2010 or 2011. You could retaliate easily. You can use the same amount of force that they used on you. They sunk one of your boats, you can sink one of their boats. They fired 20 artillery rounds at you, you can fire 20 back. But what is going to be the next step? The odds that the other side will let you have the last word are very, very, very low. And so that's why escalation risk is so important to consider. Okay, it's really one of the most underrated ideas in all of the security studies. So, the final thing I want to talk about here is the idea of escalation dominance. And this, again, it was the focus of Morgan's article. The idea of escalation dominance assumes that there is some level to which you can escalate a conflict that the other side either will not be able to meet, or if they can meet you there, they won't be able to go any further. So I think the article was written before Crimea, but Crimea is a perfect example of escalation dominance. So what happened in Ukraine? There was all of this hullabaloo, essentially the beginnings of a popular uprising against Yanukovych. Yanukovych and his Russian supporters would call it a coup with foreign backing, but whatever it is, there was massive instability in Ukraine. And Russia had these military bases throughout the country, especially in Crimea. So, actually, only in Crimea, perhaps. But the key thing is, they had these military forces that were there already. And when the Ukrainian government was not able to get its act together to coordinate a military response, Russia was basically able to take the Crimean Peninsula before anyone realized what was going on. And, okay, Ukraine is not strong enough to fight Russia on their own, obviously. But NATO, especially the United States, were kind of committed to helping Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine wasn't a NATO member, but Britain and the United States had given Ukraine security treaties as part of them giving up their nuclear weapons. See how all the pieces of these lectures fit together? Everything's all connected. So, America was supposed to defend Ukraine. And Russia took their territory, so America is supposed to help them get it back. But by the time they were able to mobilize, the Russians already had secured Crimea. So what do you do? To even play at that level, that use of military force level, and there's some gray area in that because the Russians went to great efforts to make it look like they weren't using military force, even though they were. But that's more than I have time to go into now. Let's just say simply, Russians used military force. America responded with sanctions. So that's like de-escalation. In other words, the Russians went to this level and the Americans were not willing to meet them at the same level. Okay? That's escalation dominance. And this kind of thing can happen more often than you think. What's the alternative? Russia uses military force to take Crimea. America and maybe some of its allies use military force to take Crimea back. I don't know who wins that fight, but I know it's not Ukraine. It would be like essentially we have to destroy Ukraine in order to save it. That doesn't make a lot of strategic sense. So, fait accompli. It is a thing that the Russians have done. Here it is. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, when we look at escalation dominance at a theoretical level, you would just assume that the strongest country will always have escalation dominance. But in any individual case, there are a lot of details that can make all the difference. So, the Vietnam War, again, a classic example. By fighting all out and being incredibly effective, the Vietnamese were able to essentially escalate to a level of military effectiveness, not military resources, because they couldn't match the American resources, but by fighting total war on their side, they were able to put America in a position where they have to increase the costs that they're paying for the Vietnam War to match, or they have to give up. They have to accept defeat in Vietnam. And that's what happened. So we talk sometimes about the idea of commitment in international relations. And sometimes a weaker country, a smaller state, can have the advantage if they are willing to rush to their maximum level and the other side isn't able to meet them there. Or even if they're willing to meet them there, they're not able to go beyond that. Okay? So this is why the first rule of strategy is know your enemy. Know what their interests are. Know how much they're willing to pay to impose cost on you. How far are they willing to go? And if you can go further than they're willing to go, you'll achieve escalation dominance and you will win, which is kind of the name of the game. So, that brings us to our discussion questions. Now, obviously, you don't have time to discuss this in class on account of there being no class. Feel free to discuss them with yourself or just spend a little bit of time thinking about each of them because these are important questions. The security dilemma, it is an important dynamic. How can we frame some of the conflict in the world today in terms of the security dilemma? How can we use the idea of broader security interests that I talked about in the third and fourth slides to understand that this dilemma mechanic is in effect and that this can lead to outcomes that nobody wants. And then once we realize that, work to maybe de-escalate the situation. Okay? Number 2, and this relates a lot, but not exclusively to our discussion of nuclear weapons from last week. If the Soviet Union had all of these nuclear weapons and America was able to deter them, why would they not be able to deter North Korea with their much smaller number of nuclear weapons? Why are the Americans so worried about North Korea? Let them have 100 nukes. Let them have 200. The Soviets had 40,000 or more, and it all worked out fine. So what's all the drama about? Okay. We talked about stable deterrence earlier. Nuclear deterrence is more stable than other forms of deterrence because once you can destroy them 100 times over, what does it matter if you can only, destroy them 50 times over, or 10 or 5? And this relates to number 2 potentially. But how can we see nuclear deterrence being less stable than it was during the Cold War? Okay? Compellence involves committing resources to the credible and clear threat to use force against another actor. And we're increasingly seeing more of a hands-off, I don't want to say isolationist policy by the United States, but it is clear that they want to disentangle themselves from as much of the world as they can. And this isn't just a Trump thing. Okay, we saw this in Obama. Really, every American president wants to get out of the Middle East, but they can't. But what this has led to is some situations where maybe if you'd used more of your resources, whether military or economic or something else, you actually could have solved the problem, but you didn't. So by not caring about a problem, you make it a bigger problem for yourself over the longer term, because unintended consequences is really the only law in international relations. So think about possible situations today where one or more country might be able to use compellence if they were really willing to commit to solving a problem. Would it be America as the global hegemon slash policeman slash bully, or would it be another country that might be able to use a compellent threat to reduce an ongoing conflict, or maybe even solve the problem completely? Okay. And question number 5, because we really didn't get a chance to talk about it last week, and I want to make sure it is still on your mind. Tactical nuclear weapons, smaller scale, could still be fired from a cruise missile or an artillery shell. Could they be used in a conventional conflict with our understanding of escalation from today's talk, without escalating all the way to a complete nuclear war? Okay, think about that. Obviously, if you use them against a non-nuclear power, there's a lower chance of escalation, but even that's not guaranteed. So consider some of the variables, including a nuclear power uses tactical nukes against another nuclear power. Could we still avoid full-blown nuclear war? Okay, those are all the questions I have for you. You are welcome to ask questions of me also. That's only fair. However, it would be really awesome if you did submit your questions in video form, because, I've gone to all this trouble, and maybe it even works. So feel free to submit your video questions either by email or on YSEC in the public Q&A forums. That would be great. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you had a great Chuseok.